many decades throughout the 19th century, a decadent China suffered many humiliations at the hands of foreign powers, whose military might forced them to cede vast tracts of territory. A series of events the Chinese have never forgotten.
If the Westerners come to invade you and you are not strong enough to defend yourself, you suffer humiliation. Forgetting the crimes committed by these Westerners is an even greater humiliation.
This notion of victimhood is something that we know from the history of other countries is an exceptionally dangerous product.
Reacting to a certain vision of the past, China has launched an all-out offensive to extend its power beyond its borders, especially around Taiwan and the South China Sea.
You cannot say that China is only recently paying attention to its borders. It's just that we have come to a point where these problems need to be sorted out.
We know the South China Sea they believe is their territory. We definitely know they believe Taiwan is their territory. Also disputes with India. And there's other areas. What about Mongolia?
These issues of territory and power have put Xi Jinping's China on a collision course with the United States.
The Americans regard the Pacific as an inland lake. It has become their swimming pool. One day, the US will have to end its global hegemony, especially at sea.
By seeking to re-establish itself at the expense of its neighbors, China has unleashed a spiral of incomprehension, mistrust and resentment. This escalation has ushered in an era of uncertainty and instability for the whole world, threatening to turn the Pacific into a powder keg. The conductor of this quest for power is a man on a mission to restore China to its imperial greatness. As soon as he came to power in 2012, Xi Jinping made his ambitions crystal clear.
我们的责任就是要团结带领全党、全国各族人民接过历史的接力棒。 继续为实现中华民族伟大复兴而努力奋斗。
Global power of China is a primary driving factor, not just for the Chinese state, but for the Chinese people. This is a nationalist dream, and the party's delivery of that is really important for the leadership's legitimacy and its continuance.
China's Communist Party leadership, and particularly Xi Jinping himself, see the West as in terminal decline, and this is the historical time for the rise of China, not just the rise as a nation, but as the dominant power in the world.
The notion of a great Chinese Renaissance has come to guide the government and the entire country. To become the leading power on the 21st century world stage, the new Communist Party Secretary General is convinced that China must first rule the seas.
In 2012, once Xi Jinping came onto the scene, he very quickly brought together all of the Chinese agencies, all of the dragons of the sea, if you like, to form a cohesive strategic national force at sea. You can't be a great power in the 21st century unless you are a sea power as well as a land power.
But in establishing itself as a maritime power, China faces a geographical handicap. The entire Chinese coast is bordered by shallow seas. access to the Pacific is controlled by a chain of islands, starting from Japan in the north, along through its island of Okinawa, then Taiwan, and the Philippines to the south. Since the end of World War II, these islands have all been American allies. It's a confinement that Beijing can no longer accept.
The first island chain specifically is something that, from the PRC's perspective, is a shackle, a chain. It's the front door of their house, and they need to have that front door controlled, and they need to have the key.
To break this confinement, Beijing has implemented a covert strategy of territorial annexation in contempt of international law. The South China Sea is at the heart of this strategy. This semi-closed maritime space is shared with 6 neighbours, who mainly compete for 2 groups of islets. The Paracels in the north, occupied by the Chinese since 1974, and the Spratlys in the south. Controlling these islets makes it possible to monitor the world's main trade routes, and in the event of a conflict, to prevent any blockade of the few straits providing access to the Indian Ocean. For the Chinese Communist Party, it's a key issue.
Without economic development, the Communist Party cannot remain in power. But China will be terribly short of resources for growth. It does not have enough oil reserves. It has destroyed almost all of its forests, and water resources are scarce as well.
Xi Jinping has inherited the project launched by his predecessors. In 2009, in a map addressed to the United Nations, China claimed that prior settlement gave it territorial sovereignty over 80% of the South China Sea. Using a 9-dash line, it appropriated the exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, of riparian countries, as defined by the UN. The area also encompasses the international waters at its core. China denies that the claim is in breach of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea it is a signatory to.
It isn't a matter of being legal or illegal. All these islands belong to China. When we took them back after World War II, we just raised flags there without setting up garrisons. At the time, we did not have the capacity to maintain a military presence.
For riparian countries, this 9-dash line is heresy. It robs them of almost all the maritime zones they have an exclusive claim to under international law.
They're practically claiming everything. Everything beyond our territorial sea is being claimed by China. We're losing a lot.
Over the coming years, China will seek to gradually establish this line in the sea, progressing in calibrated stages so as not to start a war. In 2012, a few months before Xi Jinping came to power, the process began at Scarborough Shoal, located in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The incident started when the Philippine Army attempted to tackle Chinese poachers on this protected atoll. Hemmed in by several Chinese Coast Guard boats, which had come to prevent arrests, the Filipinos decided to withdraw after a month. As for the Chinese, they will never leave the atoll again, with journalists eager to report Beijing's sovereignty.
那么我们今天来的一项重要的任务，就是把中华人民共和国的5星红旗再次插上黄岩岛的主礁。
A conquest achieved through intimidation and without violence.
So China's success has partly been based on the psychology of other countries backing down because either China was demonstrating superior force or in some cases China was signalling a willingness to take great risk.
This was, the first major example that broke through of the so-called gray zone strategy, of China using force below the level at which a military response would be considered proportional. And so if you can't send in the 7th Fleet, what do you do? And the answer was we didn't know.
The standoff at Scarborough Shoal made China realize that it could neutralize a stronger opponent. as Washington failed to support its ally. Engaging the 7th Fleet to defend an atoll seemed a disproportionate response. Faced with a fait accompli, not so much as an official protest was recorded.
But they didn't have to shoot any missiles or bullets. China essentially was able to seize Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines through negligence and inattention by a U.S. interlocutor that didn't defend the Philippines. And that was the tipping point, and it sent a signal across Asia that America's word could not be trusted.
China creates an asymmetry in the stakes. Do we really want to start a war with China over a reef in the Spratlys? Objectively, no.
The secret weapon of this grey area strategy is not the Chinese army, but civilians, simple fishermen from the island of Hainan or the coast guards. No one can stop them because the Chinese assume other countries will respect international law. The rules of military engagement prevent warships from opening fire on civilian vessels.
If the U.S. did decide to respond with force and open fire and kill or use other tactics that resulted in the death of these civilian crews, the U.S. would bear the responsibility of escalating the situation. So the risk of escalation is much lower than if these ships and crews were actual PLA Navy forces. This gives the Chinese much more flexibility in how they can outmuscle and coerce their neighbors.
The island of Hainan is the home base for these fishermen, who venture into the disputed areas. Here, patriotism is like a second skin. All the inhabitants are convinced that they are defending what they call the country's blue territories.
The country sends us there. This whole sea has always belonged to China, including the Spratlys. In the future, we will send all the others packing and recover more islets. They no longer dare stop us because our country has become powerful.
For a long time, no one in the area realized that lurking among the fishermen were many militiamen. China's promotional videos are quite open about the mission of this paramilitary force operating under Communist Party orders. These militiamen are the spearhead of a very real hidden people's war, to which Xi Jinping added a new dimension when he came to power. In April 2013, the party secretary made a personal visit to Hainan to congratulate the fishermen involved in the Scarborough incident and salute the militia, who had become national heroes.
习近平亲切看望了由谭门渔民组成的海上民兵连，看联史展览，听事迹介绍，勉励他们努力学习现代装备知识，提高作业能力。
这一次平安归来啊，你们表示祝贺。谢谢主席的关心啊，大家回来以后好好休息。祝你们以后的话。
The PRC has had a fishing militia for basically as long as there's been a PRC. It was just the regular militia in fishing villages. What's really changed over the last 10 years, we now know, is that some subset of that old militia has been professionalized. Beijing has begun to pour money into them. They've gotten bigger boats, steel-hulled. They're beginning to get uniforms and weapons training.
These professionalized militia have developed a carefully choreographed art of intimidation that precludes the use of weapons. On the seas, their intervention is coordinated in several stages. First, a squadron of militia fishermen is sent in to circle an isolated foreign ship. In the event of complications, the Chinese Coast Guard is poised to intervene and call in the Chinese Navy, which remains on alert in the area. This division of labor was used in 2014 to protect a Chinese oil rig forcibly drilling in disputed waters near Vietnam. 300 intentional collisions reportedly took place within 2 months, and a Vietnamese ship sank.
Beijing kept the PLA Navy ships back a bit. They were an implicit threat. This is what became known as the cabbage strategy a few years later when they used it against the Vietnamese over oil and gas drilling.
But today, the use of militias is no longer a secret. In 2021, 200 trawlers anchored alongside each other around a reef in the Filipino EEZ incited the wrath of Manila. Beijing's denials did nothing to calm its neighbor.
近期是由于海况的原因，中方的一些渔船在牛鄂礁附近避风，我想这是非常正常的。
The international community frets about the threats from these crews, but the problem does not exist. It was created by the media, claiming that the crews of these 200 fishing boats are mostly militiamen. But that isn't true. If China had to rely on maritime militias to defend its South China Sea reefs, I think they'd lose them within days.
Chinese maritime forces are now enforcing Beijing's law in the South China Sea. Ships from neighboring countries can no longer circulate freely in their own exclusive economic zones.
Immediately and keep far off. This is China Coast Guard. This area is under the jurisdiction of Chinese government. You should keep away from this area.
So you mean this is a Chinese? I think this is a Philippines water.
Over the years, a veritable invisible border has developed in the seas. 7 islets were artificially enlarged and covered with airstrips and military radars. These facilities extend the range of action of Chinese military aircraft and ships throughout the entire southern South China Sea.
What the islands do is give China dominance over the space. There are dozens of Chinese Coast Guard ships and Navy ships and hundreds of Chinese fishing militia boats in the Spratly Islands every single day, 24/7.
This omnipresence increases the risk of strategic errors, which can quickly spiral out of control.
The U.S. government has announced just a few years ago that the U.S. Navy will treat maritime militia and Coast Guard as military assets if they use lethal tactics. The U.S. will regard them as military forces and treat them with appropriate force. There is definitely a risk of escalation.
Faced with this strategy, ASEAN, the association of 10 Southeast Asian nations, is paralyzed as China eagerly stokes disunity.
ASEAN as a collective is also compromised because China has been co-opting some of the ASEAN nations, and that's why we cannot come up with a joint communique that would stand up to the interests of the ASEAN against China.
China and those riparian countries must understand that we'll always be neighbors. Yet our neighbors still need the Americans, even though we can see how they behave everywhere.
Along the coastlines bordering the South China Sea, the fishermen are the first victims. On the Filipino island of Mindoro, the increased presence of Chinese boats, even in non-disputed areas, arouses a great deal of anxiety.
There are more and more Chinese trawlers. It seems they're claiming our fishing zones because there are fewer and fewer Filipinos, and the Chinese now outnumber us. Before they came along, We had good catches, but now they're diminishing.
The ubiquitous presence of Chinese trawlers has caused a collapse in fish catches.
That will put tens of thousands, maybe more, of fishermen and those who work in the fishing industry in these villages out of work, all along the coast of the Philippines and Vietnam, and will endanger the food security of millions.
In the Philippines, many fishermen are now afraid of Chinese militias. Their fragile boats are no match for China's large iron trawlers. Junel's was sunk by one of them.
It was around midnight when a boat collided with us. It was a Chinese trawler. I don't know whether it was accidental or intentional. They should have come to our rescue when we were sinking, but they fled. When we tried to row closer to check the name and registration of the ship, they turned off their lights. Ever since then, I've been afraid to go out at sea.
In 2016, The Hague's International Arbitration Court rejected the legitimacy of Beijing's claims against the Philippines, a decision that is being challenged by China. In an attempt to defuse the situation, Beijing launched a legal battle. Ms. Zhang is part of a group of experts tasked with the response.
It's a question of territory. It's nothing to do with the arbitration tribunal, which is exceeding its powers. Yet the court still looked into the case. China is firmly opposed to the ruling. We insist that it does not have the jurisdiction.
China's goal is to wage a so-called legal war to defend its territorial vision. Its aim is to slowly change the international order.
To contest this appropriation of the sea by Beijing, Western navies are increasing their presence in the area. From a legal standpoint, it's about imposing the maritime law that Beijing seeks to challenge.
It could mean going inside the disputed area and doing circles or zigzags or something of that nature. But the idea is that you're there, you're showing that you do not respect the claim. If you don't exercise a right and to challenge somebody's claim that that's not their territorial water, then over time the legal institution would say becomes a fact.
The Chinese are very good at this threshold strategy, the policy of ambiguity. We're trying to force them out of ambiguity and make them acknowledge their role in assuming sovereignty, which they are very evasive about right now.
Chinese obduracy reminds the international community of its powerlessness. Patriotic tourism thrives on these islands, forbidden to foreigners. By accelerating the infrastructure development, Beijing is attempting to make things irreversible.
The USA and Japan asked for compliance with the decision, but what does that entail? China abandoning its 9-dash line? Chinese fishermen ceasing to fish in the South China Sea? Is that achievable? These countries are making naive demands.
For the international community, this policy of fait accompli is seen as a wake-up call.
Are we setting precedents for how China may behave elsewhere in the world? So it opens questions about the future of the Indian Ocean, the future of the Pacific, even the future of the Antarctic.
If all countries of the world start violating international law and treaties, the world will be in a state of chaos. I mean, we need order, stability, predictability, certainty. I mean, it cannot be that the world is run on this principle of might is right.
With an uncompromising vision of its territorial claims, China is now dragging the international community into a spiral. And the battleground that threatens to spiral out of control is Taiwan. For Xi Jinping, Taiwan is the centerpiece of China's national renaissance. Only this is not some remote desert island. Taiwan is home to 23 million Chinese-speaking inhabitants, heirs to a historical legacy bequeathed by the Cold War. This was the island that the nationalist troops, routed by Mao in 1949, fled to. Lack of military resources forced Beijing to abandon its plan to invade, dissuaded by the massive deployment of the US Navy's 7th Fleet.
It was the Americans who sabotaged our plan with their 7th Fleet, amassed in the Strait. Without them, we would have already liberated Taiwan in 1950.
Washington finally recognized the People's Republic in 1979. But since then, America has continued to protect Taiwan by raising the prospect of a possible armed intervention in the event of any military operation from Beijing. For Xi Jinping, this American umbrella has become a symbol of humiliation that must be dispensed with. It's a promise that leaves little room for compromise.
The Americans are using Taiwan as a pawn to oppress China and prevent its great renaissance. The Xi Jinping era must mark the surpassing of the United States, the resolution of the Taiwan problem, and total unification of China. He hopes to surpass the exploits of every leader in Chinese history. Without this piece of the puzzle of unifying Taiwan, how can he possibly achieve his goal of national renaissance?
The more they use the issue of Taiwan or Hong Kong or Xinjiang as a source of legitimacy to govern, the less they can backtrack.
Today, the prospect of a political solution between Taipei and Beijing is receding sharply. The island is now an exemplary democracy, and its inhabitants know that reunification would cost them their freedom. In January 2020, voters elected for a second term a president fiercely opposed to any concessions. But Beijing turns a deaf ear and categorically rejects the choice of the Taiwanese. For the Communist Party, all that remains is intimidation.
昨天发生大陆呢有20架次的军机扰台之后，解放军在今天一大早又2度的侵扰我防空的识别区。
In the midst of a pandemic, the party is taking advantage of the global chaos to intensify air raids around Taiwan.
The current situation in the Taiwan Strait is probably the worst it has been for 20 years. There is no official interaction, and the atmosphere of mutual hatred between peoples is at its height. Chinese military planes and warships enter our seas and airspace every day to intimidate us. These are very, very bad signs.
I believe that they want to go out of their way to not use military force. But now when I'm seeing what Beijing's doing right now in this last year or two, and the noose is getting tighter and tighter around Taiwan's neck.
70 years after Mao's retreat, the balance of power has radically changed between Beijing and Taipei. The Chinese Navy has been dramatically modernized by Xi Jinping. In April 2021, he launched 3 warships on the same day, including a submarine charged with nuclear missiles.
In France, when you arm a boat, you are pleased. But 3 at the same time, it's an extremely impressive progression. Initially, it was patrol boats, then corvettes, frigates, now destroyers and aircraft carriers.
And they have done something incredible in 20 years to go from basically having a coastal navy to now having a navy that's the largest in the world, and it's growing. They're producing basically 4 ships to 1 against the United States.
If China becomes stronger and stronger, disproportionately so, then it will no longer be a choice between independence, reunification, or the status quo, rather between reunification and war.
Beijing likes to portray this maritime power in Hollywood-style promotional films. With 360 vessels, China now has more battleships than the US Navy. Occupied for 30 years in land wars, the Americans themselves are beginning to doubt their potential to act as a deterrent.
Around Taiwan, the military capability can inflict huge losses on the US military forces if they got involved in a conflict. So it is that contradiction between growing Chinese military power and weakening US military position that I think contributes to anxiety on the part of military generals and admirals in the US.
The United States Navy hasn't fought a naval war since World War II. We have great capability in space, in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. We have great capability in combined operations, joint operations. But if we're trying to defend a tiny island nation, I'm not sure we have any more experience than what the Chinese would have.
Faced with this pressure, Taiwan barricades itself. Having lived with the threat of war for 70 years, the Taiwanese armed forces have turned the island into a booby-trapped fortress. Every year, the army carries out exercises in anticipation of the worst-case scenario, a Chinese landing on their island.
When China launches an attack on Taiwan, the final phase will have to be a landing, as the destruction of important facilities in Taiwan by missile will not be sufficient to ensure military success.
A Chinese military victory to seize Taiwan, or a coercive victory of subjugating Taiwan through non-military means, that doesn't guarantee China's interest and security in the long run. Just imagine the insurgency, China's security forces, to spend the next 20 years, 25 years trying to subjugate a defiant population of 23 million people on Taiwan. It would make Hong Kong look like a picnic.
For the president, these drills are an opportunity to recall the determination of the Taiwanese not to give in.
国家安全从来就不是靠卑躬屈膝，而是要仰赖最坚实的国防，而我们所有的国军官兵就是国防的核心。
Faced with the growing threat, the Taiwanese authorities are now eager to convince the rest of the world that the fate of the island is a global issue.
If they are able to impose their authoritarian order on Taiwan like what they did to Hong Kong, that means the democratic world is suffering a big loss. And if China can do that to Taiwan without opposition from the international community, then China can repeat what Germany was doing during the Second World War. If they can take Taiwan, they can take other parts of East Asia, or they can take parts of India or part of Russia. So I think this is a very serious situation.
A feeling of impending disaster has taken hold in the region, as well as across the Pacific.
Just a few days after U.S. President Joe Biden took office, Washington and Beijing
Welcome back. China continues to taunt and test the new administration and the world, sending 15 fighter jets.
To America, Taiwan is the fuse that could ignite the powder keg. Elected in November 2020, Joe Biden resumed his predecessor's policy of confronting China.
We are going to hold China accountable to follow the rules. To follow the rules. Whether it relates to the South China Sea or the North China Sea or the agreement made on Taiwan or a whole range of other things. China has an overall goal, and I don't criticize them for the goal, but they have an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen on my watch.
I had assumed that Biden would not follow Trump's strategy in the Pacific. Not only has Biden run with it, he's also developing it. He's deploying it faster.
In Washington, the challenge posed by Xi Jinping's Renaissance project has become existential. For the Americans, their influence in Asia and all around the world is inextricably linked to the fate of Taiwan. Taiwan is a lock on the first chain of islands, the key to the network of alliances established in Asia by the Americans after the Second World War. Should Beijing take control, China could keep America at bay right across Asia, with a barrage of missiles, aircraft and submarines, which would become undetectable in the depths east of the island. It would usher in a new era.
If Taiwan is seized by the Chinese, that punches a big hole through this first island chain. And that means that the PLA will occupy it, they'll fortify it in the way that they've done in the South China Sea, only on a much larger scale. And they'll be operating from there well further into the Pacific, into the mid-Pacific, also into Japan.
It would be the end of America in the Asia Pacific. It would cease to be a factor anymore because, first of all, it would destroy America's credibility. Once the U.S. was essentially shoved out of the Western Pacific, then the Chinese would then operate off of the west coast of the United States at some point.
Does the Western world stand by and just let it happen? My view is that the United States, in that circumstance, probably, in most circumstances, will not let that happen.
American determination is bolstered by cross-party agreement between Republicans and Democrats about the need to toughen up on China, even though they're taken aback by the change in tone from Beijing. Spring 2021. It is the first time that the new head of American diplomacy has met Xi Jinping's emissaries. The mood turns to public humiliation.
We'll also discuss our deep concerns with actions by China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States.
While the world looks on, the two Chinese government envoys issue their brutal reply. Today, China no longer takes lessons from anyone. She gives them.
你们没有资格在中国的面前说你们从实力的地位出发同中国谈话。20年前、30年前，你们就没有这个地位讲这话，因为中国人是不吃这一套的。
Today's diplomats don't really do diplomacy anymore. They posture as rivals to the West. It looks more like aversion.
The aggressive stance of the diplomats is actually aimed at the Chinese public. The stunt is a hit with a population cut off from the world since the pandemic. On the internet, many youths display a rejection of Western symbols.
中国网民群情激愤，耐克挣中国的钱，砸中国的锅，起无耻嘴脸。
今天是爱国的日子，怎么办？为啥不能吃美国的东西，都等于在卖国？
他无法理解为什么对。
The Chinese do not understand why Westerners criticize their country when it is so successful. Why criticize it so much and try to reverse the model? They regard the Chinese model as the future. Incomprehension turns into hatred and refusal of dialogue.
You got 1.4 billion people that are being fed that the world is against them, the world occupied them, the world mistreated them, and stole their property, stole their territory.
Encouraged by the Communist Party, this nationalism has become a rallying cry, spurring on the government in the battle to settle territorial issues. In July 2021, Xi Jinping issued a belligerent warning to Westerners without naming Taiwan.
中国人民也绝不允许任何外来势力欺负、压迫、奴役我们。谁妄想这样干，必将在14多亿中国人民用血肉铸成的钢铁长城面前碰得头破血流。
The party's first secretary wants to dissuade the rest of the world from opposing his plan. He wants to give the impression that he is ready to sacrifice world peace to achieve his aims.
We have got to understand that the aim of the Communist Party of China is to dominate the world. It wants to see Australia as a vassal state.
On the other side of the Pacific, the feeling of insecurity has reached a historic ally of the United States. 4,000 kilometers from China, Australia would be on the front line alongside the Americans in the event of any conflict in Taiwan. In July 2020, the Australian Prime Minister announced a 40% increase in his country's military budget over the next 10 years. He based his justification on historical precedent.
Ladies and gentlemen, the strategic challenges of today and tomorrow call Australia, in many ways as we've been called before, at difficult times, to play our part in a region where peace, stability and prosperity cannot be taken for granted. 2020 has demonstrated once again the multiple challenges and radical uncertainty we face, eerily haunted by similar times many years ago in the 1930s. Today, with the Indo-Pacific experiencing...
He did not specifically name China, and he did not specifically make analogies between China and the totalitarian powers of the 1930s, but there are some obvious analogies that some observers would draw. Australia is now imagining a much darker future. We must modernise our military, we must make our economy more resilient, we must diversify our economic relationships, we must become more self-reliant.
Australians got a taste of this new era on June the 3rd, 2019.
A big grey ship with a big red flag. One of three.
That day, a Chinese amphibious assault group with 700 troops on board made its brazen entrance into Sydney Harbour.
And virtually no one knew they were coming. These three warships turn up in Sydney Harbour, and it caused great consternation among many people. And those pictures, those images back in China, they sent a very clear message. China's power is everywhere.
In recent years, Chinese power has moved closer to the Australian coast. And there is a growing concern in Canberra about the proliferation of Chinese seaport or airport projects in the surrounding Pacific Islands. Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Tonga, Kiribati, as far as Port Darwin on its own territory. The new Chinese silk routes being deployed in the seas are changing the strategic situation by potentially cutting off Australia from its American ally.
From a strategic point of view, let's not forget that the new Chinese silk routes and their maritime variations are not only a matter of trade or infrastructure investments, they also have military implications.
Within just a few years, China's status as Australia's main economic partner has shifted, and it is now regarded as a potential enemy. In 2018, the country barricaded itself when an official study revealed that 80% of foreign donations to its political parties came from the People's Republic of China, undermining the way the country's democracy works. Legislation was introduced to criminalize covert foreign operations.
The Chinese Communist Party wants to erode resistance to it from within Western democracies. That's why they've devoted so many resources to influencing, interfering in Australia with a view to breaking us away from the American alliance.
To punish Australia, Beijing employed economic weapons. In October 2020, China suddenly ceased imports of Australian coal, blocking cargo ships at sea for several months outside its ports.
Please help us get home as early as possible.
Chinese dreams, if they create a rising tide of prosperity, security, stability for all in the region and beyond, would be most welcome. But if the Chinese dream becomes a nightmare for other countries, then it's a serious problem. And there will be counter pressures, there will be countervailing actions and reactions from others, both in the neighborhood and beyond.
The rise in tensions has precipitated new alliances between maritime democracies and revived the concept of an Indo-Pacific. New Delhi has become a key partner, cautiously breaking with its historical non-alignment. India also feels hemmed in by China on the seas. Since 2014, Beijing has moved in on many ports in the region, thanks to its new maritime silk routes.
In the long run, India will be one of the big powers this century, and of course it is a civilizational rival to China. So any balancing strategy to set limits to Chinese power has to include India. India can complicate China's choices.
The upshot of these alliances has been a flurry of military activity. To show their ability to operate together, joint naval exercises have proliferated in the Pacific. In May 2021, for the first time, the French took part in a naval exercise alongside the Japanese and Americans off the coast of Japan.
When the international community sends a signal to China expressing its opposition and telling them it is unreasonable to act the way they do, it certainly acts as a deterrent.
In Beijing, this military activity is viewed as evidence of a united front against China, further fueling the nationalist feeling of living in a besieged fortress.
The Chinese are very angry. What they are doing reminds us of the humiliating history of Western invasions in the 19th century. How to react? Well, we must accelerate our military development. Something good can come out of something bad. That's why I invite them to continue with their little military demonstrations to educate the Chinese people in national defense.
Faced with an increasingly belligerent China, the Americans, Australians and British have opted to intensify the standoff with Beijing by launching an underwater counter-offensive, exploiting China's weak spot. In September 2021, the three countries created a military alliance called AUKUS. Canberra announced the purchase of 8 US nuclear-powered submarines. It is the first time since the Cold War that the USA has shared this sensitive technology. A controversial decision that the American president justified by a sense of urgency.
Our nations will update and enhance our shared ability to take on the threats of the 21st century, just as we did in the 20th century, together. Our nations and our brave fighting forces have stood shoulder to shoulder for literally more than 100 years.
Might the direction being taken by Beijing be reinforcing the very encirclement from which China wishes to escape? Many Chinese no longer identify with Xi Jinping's vision and fear the country's isolation.
Within the Chinese Communist Party, there are many rumblings that Xi Jinping has really gone too far. There's so much blowback on China that they are worried that it will undermine the legitimacy of the party within China in the same way that the party has lost legitimacy and support internationally.
Many Chinese believe that China should not turn in on itself and seek conflict with the rest of the world. That those choices are a dead-end situation. Chinese history clearly shows that autarky under Mao led us nowhere.
Tensions are high, there can be risks of miscalculations, there can be uncontrolled escalation after that. I mean, at each stage in history when wars have broken out is not because we have willed it, but because we have miscalculated.
By linking China's national renaissance to the expansion of its territory, Xi Jinping may have sown the seeds of his own failure. In opting for force, he has perhaps revealed his weakness. Will the fear of nuclear escalation with the United States be enough to deter Beijing from open conflict? By playing on uncertainty, China is forcing the rest of the world into a backward-looking standoff, far from the real challenges of the 21st century.